Okay, so when I say the name Alexander Graham Bell, what's the first thing that pops into your head? It's the telephone, right? Of course it is, an invention that literally changed the world. But what if I told you that one invention is just a tiny piece of a much bigger, way more complicated, and honestly, a more fascinating story? We're going to dig into the man behind the legend.
Yeah, this is the picture we all know. Bell, the famous inventor, the icon connecting these huge cities and, well, eventually the entire planet. The telephone totally defined his public image and cemented his place in the history books forever.
But here's a wild thought. What if, in his own mind, the telephone was actually an intrusion, a distraction from what he considered his real work? That's the question we're going to dive into as we uncover the true story of Alexander Graham Bell.
So to really understand Bell, you can't start with the telephone. You have to go all the way back to the beginning, to the thing that drove him his entire life, this deep personal obsession with sound and speech. See, for Bell, sound wasn't some abstract scientific concept. It was personal. His own mother started losing her hearing when he was just a kid, and later, his wife Mabel was also deaf. So the challenge of communication, of connecting with the people he loved most, it was woven into the very fabric of his daily life.
And get this, it was a family affair. His grandfather and his father were both experts in elocution, which is the art of speaking clearly. His dad even created this incredible system called visible speech, using symbols to teach deaf people how to pronounce words. I mean, Bell was literally born into a world that was all about the mechanics of the human voice.
And this little story just says it all. As a young man, way before the telephone was even a thought, he figured out that if he spoke in a certain way right into his mother's forehead, she could feel the vibrations and hear him. He was already experimenting with acoustics just to connect with his mom.
And this is maybe the most crucial thing to understand about him. If you asked Alexander Graham Bell what he did for a living, he wouldn't say inventor. He'd say he was a teacher of the deaf. That was his true identity, his real passion. Everything else was secondary. But funny enough, it was one of his side projects, this little experiment about sending speech over a wire that would end up changing everything. And that little experiment kicked off one of the biggest tech races of the entire 19th century.
Okay, you can't make this stuff up. The timing here is just unbelievable. On Valentine's Day, 1876, Bell's lawyer files a patent application for the telephone. On the exact same day, another inventor, Elisha Gray, files something called a patent caveat, which is basically like calling dibs on an invention for a super similar device. It was literally a photo finish.
But Bell's application got stamped just a little bit earlier. And a few weeks later, boom, he was granted what would become one of the most valuable patents in the history of the world. He won the race by just a matter of hours.
And just 3 days after that patent came through, history was made. Bell and his assistant, Thomas Watson, were working in their lab when Bell spoke those very first iconic words through the new device. So simple, so direct, and so incredibly world-changing. So, you now own the patent to the telephone. What do you think that's worth? Bell's company actually offered to sell it to Western Union, the telegraph giant, for just $100,000. And their president turned them down flat. He supposedly called it an electrical toy. That has to be one of the biggest business blunders in all of history. So after Western Union passed on the toy, things just exploded. The Bell Telephone Company pops up in 1877. Less than a decade later, you've got over 150,000 phones in American homes. The network grew like wildfire, all leading up to this amazing moment in 1915 when Bell made the very first coast-to-coast call to his old pal Thomas Watson, who was all the way over in San Francisco. But remember what I said about the telephone being a distraction for him? Well, now that he was famous and, incredibly wealthy from it, he was finally free to chase all his other interests. And believe me, this guy's mind just never, ever stopped. For example, check out the photophone. Back in 1880, he was transmitting sound wirelessly on a beam of light. I mean, that's basically the core idea behind modern fiber optic technology. He was decades ahead of his time. And get this, Bell himself said the photophone was his greatest achievement, even better than the telephone. He was also obsessed with speed on the water, so he started developing these experimental boats called hydrofoils. They literally lift up and fly across the surface. In 1919, his boat, the HD-4, set a world speed record of over 70 miles an hour, and that record stood for 10 years. And of course, he looked to the sky.
He started a group called the Aerial Experiment Association, and they were right there at the dawn of aviation. Their coolest creation, the Silver Dart, actually made the very first powered flight in all of Canadian history.
And the list just keeps going. It's almost unbelievable. He whipped up an early metal detector to try and find a bullet in President Garfield after he was shot. He invented a simple form of air conditioning. He tinkered with desalination, alternative fuels. He was even talking about the need for solar power way back in 1917. The man's curiosity was just endless. But look, a life that influential is never simple, and it's definitely not without controversy. So we've got to take a look at the more challenging and criticized parts of Bell's legacy too.
First off, that patent. Remember Elisha Gray and the race to the patent office? Well, that was just the start. The Bell Company had to defend that patent in court 587 times. 5 of those cases even went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in the end, the Bell Company never lost a single one that went to a final trial.
Bell also got into the really thorny science of heredity. He wrote a paper exploring the idea that if deaf people married other deaf people, it might lead to what he called a deaf race. Now, this kind of research put him in the orbit of the eugenics movement. But, and this is a really important point, he was very clear, as you see in this quote, that he was against any laws that would tell people who they could or could not marry. And his life's passion, teaching the deaf, also became a source of major controversy. He was a huge champion of something called oralism, teaching deaf children to speak and read lips so they could fit into the hearing world. But a lot of people in the deaf community saw this as a direct attack on their own culture and their own vibrant language, sign language. This remains a really divisive part of his story.
So what we're left with is this picture, an icon, for sure, a giant of invention, but also a man whose life was this absolute whirlwind of genius and passion and, yeah, some real controversy. He connected the entire world, but his own story is full of these complex connections that we're still trying to understand today. Because in the end, Alexander Graham Bell wasn't just the guy who invented the telephone. He was a person completely driven by this bottomless need to understand things, to tinker, and to connect. And that leaves us with one last question, really. What is that spark? What fuels a lifetime of that kind of relentless curiosity?